Hey everybody, my name is Mark Victor, and I am the founder of the global peace movement that we call Live and Let Live. Today I want to take a little deeper dive into rule number 2, otherwise known as the moral principle, and of course described with the very short phrase, just be a good human, right? Not that confusing. Last time we talked about rule number 1, otherwise known as the legal principle, and described with the phrase, don't be an aggressor. Okay, well, the first thing to talk about here is there's more going on here than just two different types of rules, right? Rule number 1, the legal principle, and rule number 2, the moral principle. What's really important to understand is how these rules are tremendously, totally, radically different in a very important way. And so this is maybe the most important point to get. Rule number 1, the legal principle, that's the mandatory rule. That applies to everybody, right? All people, groups, corporations, governments, whether they agree or not. Nobody gets to be an aggressor. But rule number 2, the moral principle, be a good human, this is totally optional. That's right, you don't have to follow rule number 2. But we, in the Live and Let Live movement, we're going to do our best to convince you that you should follow this rule. And the reason that we have two different rules here is rule number 1, if people comply with rule number 1, to the extent that's the law and people comply with it, we get freedom. That's what freedom is. Freedom is when you are in charge of your body, your property, your money, your time. That gets us to a free society or a free world if we can get the legal principle extended around the whole world. But this is a peace movement, not just a freedom movement. Of course, we can't talk about peace until we first achieve freedom, right? Because if people are aggressing against each other, there's no sense of talking about peace. We're far from peace. But if people refrain from aggressing against each other, or at least when they do, they're prosecuted and tried for what might be a criminal offense, and we deal with it through the criminal justice system. That gets us to freedom, but not to peace. Peace requires something more. Peace requires something voluntary. And that's really what the be a good human portion is calculated to get us to. Remember, you can't mandate a virtuous society. You have to earn one. You have to advocate for one. You have to convince people to act a certain way. And that's really what rule number 2, the moral principle, is about. Okay, so be a good human. What does this mean exactly? Well, my guess is you probably have a pretty good idea already. Now, I know some of you are thinking, be a good human. Okay, there's lots of interpretation questions here. And you know what? You're right. Around the edges, certainly people can argue about what exactly a good human means. But in what we call the heartland, I think you got a pretty good idea of what we're talking about with this idea of just be a good human, what we're encouraging people to try to aspire to. And so, in this vein, we have some what we call aspirational values. Now, these are values we're asking people to aspire to, right? Do your best to try to hold up these values. And these are all calculated to get us in the direction of be a good human. And so I want to talk about each one of the aspirational values. First off, I always lead with the aspirational value of open-mindedness. Now, what do we mean by open-mindedness? It doesn't mean that you have to have your mind changed easily or be fickle, or just because you've heard somebody bring some new argument or position, you automatically have to change your mind. That's not what open-mindedness is about. But it is about listening and be open-minded. If somebody does change your view, which might be a very firmly held view, you should thank them, right? They did you a good service. They improved your position on something. All of us are mistaken about some things. Nobody's perfect. We're all imperfect humans, every single one of us. And as imperfect humans, sometimes we act imperfectly. Sometimes we believe things that are just wrong. Sometimes we believe things that could be better put in focus with more information. All we're saying here, all we're really suggesting, is that you remain open-minded on all issues. Nothing should be off the table. Whatever it is you believe, if somebody has some argument about why you shouldn't believe that, let's at least listen to them. What's the harm in that? That's what open-mindedness is about. Be open-minded on all issues at all times, really as to all people. Doesn't mean you have to change your mind. That's fine. That's the first aspirational value. The next aspirational value is tolerance. Okay, look, people live differently around the planet, right? They look differently, they love differently, they have different color skin, they eat different foods, they speak different languages, they're born in different places. So what? Can't we just be big enough to at least be tolerant in terms of how other people live their lives? Now, I mean tolerant here sort of in a legal sense, right? You don't have to agree with how other people live. They may live in ways you don't like at all. You may find what they're doing to be immoral or unwise or unhealthy or not warranted, maybe not even in their own best interest. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you can try to convince them otherwise, but if you can't, can we at least be tolerant to let them live however they want to live, so long as they don't violate rule number one, right? As long as they're not aggressors. Nobody has a right to be an aggressor. But if they're not violating rule number one, let's at least be tolerant about how other people live their lives. How about voluntary kindness? Now, this should be contrasted with forced kindness. Forced kindness really isn't kindness at all. You don't have any option to not be kind here. What's an example? What am I talking about here? Well, for example, when some people want to put charity into the law. So you don't have an option. You're taxed, and then your money is taken and spent on what might be a really great cause. That's not what we're talking about with voluntary kindness. Voluntary kindness means you have a choice to not be kind at all, and yet you choose to be kind. That's what charity is. That's real charity. That's the only kind of charity. It's the kind that comes from your heart. It's the kind that you do when you don't have to. You do it because you want to. And we want to encourage people to be voluntarily kind to other people. Do something good for someone else. It's not all about you or me. We're all living on the planet together, right? We're all human beings. We're here for a short period of time. We want to inspire people to be voluntarily kind to others, right? Some people are born into great circumstances. If you're listening to this video, you are probably one of them. If you've got the kind of time to sit and listen to this video and listen to me talk about rule number 2, the moral principle, be a good human, that means you're probably not worried about where your next meal is coming from. You're probably in relative safety and reasonably good health. Okay, you're probably pretty lucky. You were born at the best time ever to be born. And you may live in one of the best places ever to live. Well, not everybody is so lucky. Let's be voluntarily kind to those who are less fortunate, maybe than we are. How about civility as an aspirational value? We should lead by example, right? We don't have to call people names and belittle people. Nobody's perfect here, certainly not me, probably not you. But can we do better? Can we try to lead by example? Let's be civilized towards other people. It's okay if we disagree on things. No two people agree on everything. But when you disagree, how you disagree is important, right? Let's try to disagree in ways that are agreeable. Let's try to relate to other human beings in a way that's civilized, at least. And so that's what we're pushing for with this aspirational value of civility, right? Think about how we present, think about how we speak to other people, think about how we act. Let's try to lead here. The world could use more civility. All right, justice. Look, we don't want to just force our way to where we want to go. We need to inspire people. What I mean by justice is we should never violate rule number 1. We should never aggress against anybody to accomplish any particular means. Justice is really important, right? How we get things done. We don't aggress against other people. If we're going to have a hearing, let's do it with due process. Let's have a real, fair hearing, listening to both sides. That's what justice is about. We don't want to just race to the end and accomplish things by any means necessary. We want to do things in a way that is just at all times. Also, building high levels of trust with other human beings. This is hugely important. If you care about relationships with other human beings, take a minute and just think about the best relationships you have with other people. I'm willing to bet those are the ones with the high levels of trust. You've earned a high level of trust. You've built a high level of trust with another human being. If you think about the bad relationships, the ones that aren't so great, those are very likely the ones with the low levels of trust. Do whatever you can to be trustworthy. You can't build a high level of trust unless you're first trustworthy. But never miss an opportunity to build trust with another human being. Your word should really mean something. We need to get back to trust, how important trust is. And so we want to inspire people to build high levels of trust with as many people as possible. I promise you, if you try this, you'll find you have better relationships with your fellow human beings. Being committed to truth in facts, whatever they are, even if they're different than something I or you currently believe, right? I mean, what if the truth of a situation is different than you believe or I believe? What's more important? To just justify keeping your current belief or adopting something that's more accurate, that better reflects the truth of the world? We think, at least in the Live and Let Live movement, that we should inspire people to really pursue truth, whatever it is, in facts, whatever they are, especially in the case where they're different. Again, nobody's perfect. If you learn you're wrong about something, this is an opportunity to build some trust, right? And say, hey, you know what? I was wrong. I made a mistake about something. Thanks so much for changing my mind. I'm going to adopt a different position going forward. It's a great opportunity, really, to teach. Nobody's perfect. Let's act consistently with that idea. So pursuing truth and facts, wherever they are. We're not just trying to push a narrative here. We really want to find out what's true about the world. And of course, rational thought. Rational thought's important, right? We want to discourage people from just emotionally thinking or thinking carelessly or sloppily. We want to really do our best to encourage people to think rationally, to draw rational inferences from facts, whatever they are. These are the aspirational values that we're pushing to try to get people to move in the direction of be a good human. Now, you might ask yourself, Mark, why have rule number 2? Why should I care about being a good human? Well, as I said earlier, we really can't ever achieve peace until we first stop aggressing against each other, which means we comply with rule number 1, the legal principle. We need to enshrine that into the law. But that doesn't get us everywhere, right? We could still be acting horribly to each other. We could be shouting ugly insults at each other and still not be aggressing. That's not being at peace, right? We want to actually get to peace. Peace requires something additional, something voluntary. And why do we care about this? Because our overall goals here, the reason we have this, the reason we care about peace, is we want to optimize human happiness and well-being. Doesn't that seem like a reasonable goal? If we're going to try to do something here, let's go big. Let's try to really optimize human happiness and well-being, while at the same time minimizing suffering. Sometimes I like to say minimizing the suffering of all living things. I didn't say eliminating the suffering. I don't think that's probably too high a goal. It'd be great if we could eliminate all suffering, but that's probably not realistic, right? We're not aiming towards perfection or utopia here. That's not one of our options. We want to dramatically improve the world. So let's try to reduce suffering, I say for all living things, but minimally, let's at least do our best to reduce human suffering. These are our goals with this moral principle, rule number 2. And again, you're completely free to ignore it. Now, let me just say, this is a non-exhaustive list. That's how we lawyers like to say it. What do I mean by that? There could be other things on the list. You might have some other ideas that contribute to being a good human. That's fine. Put it in your language if you like. We don't want to go too far with this because not all people agree on morality, right? We're just kind of sticking our big toe into the pond of morality. I don't think it's very controversial to push the idea that we should at least try to be good humans. We should be trying to pursue the aspirational values. We should care about optimizing human happiness and well-being while minimizing suffering. I like to say, in terms of being a good human, bring out the best new version of you. What do I mean by this? Well, look, each of us has made mistakes in life. Think about those mistakes we've made and think about, how can I learn from those? How can I improve? How can I bring out a brand new version of me to present to the world? You ever think about this? I encourage you to try it, especially when you meet somebody new. They don't know about any of your history or any of the mistakes you have made. Why not start out and say, you know what? I'm going to bring the best new version of me so far. Nothing that says you can't bring out another new version 6 months or a year from now. That's up to you. But that's something that maybe we should add to the list of aspirational values. Bring out a brand new, best version of you thus far, with the idea in mind that you're going to have another better version down the road still. Okay, so that's the easy stuff. Probably this isn't very controversial so far. But look, as I said at the beginning, rule number 2 is optional. I think reasonable people like rule number 2. I don't think I've said anything very controversial here, but not everybody is reasonable. We can demand that they don't be aggressors, but we can't demand that they be good humans. That's just the nature of things, right? Again, as I said, we can't pass a law that just says we must live in a virtuous society. Things just don't work that way. So there are some people who might say, look, Mark, I don't care about any of this be a good human stuff. Not interested in open-mindedness, don't care about tolerance or kindness towards other people. I'm an uncivilized guy, I don't care about facts and the truth or building high levels of trust with anybody. Fine. I think we have a good case to convince them otherwise. It actually is in their own personal best interest, in their long-term best interest, to act in conformity with these aspirational values. But people may choose not to do that. And just like in the First Amendment free speech realm, we got to defend their rights to live that way, so long as they don't aggress. Now, what do I mean here? What's the analogy to free speech? Most people understand that if you're going to defend a right to free speech, what this means is not everybody's going to say things that we like. People sometimes say horribly offensive things, horribly ignorant things, terrible things. But if it's only speech, we defend it. And I can tell you, as a lawyer, I would defend your right to say some horrible thing that I completely disagreed with. That's right. I'm big enough to defend your right to say anything you want, at least not have the government censoring the content of that speech. Certainly not because I disagree with it. Okay, so let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here, right? And I'm going to pick on a group that I absolutely disagree with, the white supremacists. Look, I'll just tell you, I was raised out of the Jewish tradition. So let's use me as an example. Let's just say this white supremacist says, I hate all Jews. I think they're terrible. I want nothing to do with them. I can tell you I'd be the first person in line to defend that person's right to say such a thing, even though I disagree with it and I think it's a terrible statement. Why would it be any different if they want to live in some horrible way that doesn't violate rule number 1? Imagine the same white supremacist now owns a restaurant and says, I'm not serving any Jews. I don't like Jews, especially the short lawyer kind like me. I would defend the rights of that restaurant owner to refuse to do business with me. Now, why do I do this? Why would I say that? Because I don't have any right to impose my morality on another person through the law. I insist that the person doesn't aggress. So they don't get to lay hands on anybody. They don't get to be violent with anybody. But I don't have a right to enter somebody else's store and demand that they do business with me, that they trade with me in some way. I recognize that. And by the way, why would I want to do business with such a person in any event? This would be a horribly, really bad policy, especially in today's world where information flows so freely. I wouldn't expect in a reasonably good community such a white supremacist type who refuses to do business with Jewish people like me or other people, because there's lots of other people on the list probably such a person wouldn't want to trade with. I don't think that person would be in business very long. In fact, there's nothing that stops me from boycotting, picketing, putting up a list on the website of businesses that refuse to do business with other people for crazy reasons like bias and prejudice and racist reasons and things like that. But I certainly would defend their right to take such a position. And that right there is the cost. That's the price we have to pay if we want to get to peace. We simply can't put our morality, even the good morality, the kind that we want to say, look, don't discriminate against other people, follow all the aspirational values I just laid out, which certainly doesn't leave any room for racism or discrimination like that. These people aren't good live and let live people. They might follow rule number 1, but they certainly don't follow rule number 2. But they have every right to ignore rule number 2. And if we don't defend their right to refuse to follow rule number 2, this is the same as us putting our morality into the law. And if we want to put our morality into the law, guess what? So does that white supremacist. So do so many other people. That's the source of our problems right now, where lots of people with different ethical and moral ideas are all trying to use this instrument called the government to force their way of life on other people. The question is, can we agree to not put even the morality we agree with into the law? Can we refuse to do that? What if it meant we could get to freedom and peace? What if it meant we could really increase prosperity around the world? I'm suggesting here, small price to pay. We got to let people be what you might consider peaceful racists. Okay, not in our crowd. These aren't people who are live and let livers because they don't agree with rule number 1 and rule number 2, but they still get to live and be left alone unless they aggress. So that's the price we got to pay to keep even our good morality out of the law. My question is, are you willing to pay that price? If you're not, then we're going to be left with this war of all against all, where everybody's trying to impose their morality, to tell others how to live. Look, I'd love to get on that train because we probably have some similar ideas in terms of morality, but I'm not going to force my morality on anybody else. Why? Because what would we say to people who are trying to force different moral views on us? We only have 2 options here. Option number 1, sorry, my morality goes into the law and yours doesn't. Mine's better than yours. Do we really want to say that? That's going to cause this kind of a problem. Forever, we're going to be in a war of all against all. But we've agreed, for the sake of achieving freedom and peace and even prosperity, that we all take all of our morality out of the law. Now look, as a small point here, I recognize that rule number 1, the rule not to be an aggressor, this of course is derived from a moral view. But you might consider the rule against aggression the least common denominator of morality. In fact, it's the rule that all reasonable people would agree on. If you're for aggression, you're certainly not reasonable, right? Reasonable people use conversation and words to persuade other people, not aggression and force. So anyways, I'm submitting to you this is the only way. This isn't one option to get to peace. It's the only way to get to peace. We simply can't force our morality, even the good morality that we all agree on other people. It's best to just say, look, for the sake of getting to freedom and peace, we all agree to take our morality out of the law. So let's advocate as persuasively as we can to get people to adopt rule number 2 and to be a good human. It is in their interest. We have an excellent argument here. People would live better if they adopted the aspirational values that I've laid out here, but they don't have to if they don't want to. Okay, so that's the deep dive into rule number 2. I hope you understand that. Nothing's easy. There is a hard price here. We got to leave that peaceful racist alone. We got to leave people who are immoral but peaceful alone. Now, this is in terms of the law. We can still advocate against them. We can picket, we can protest, we can refuse to do business with, we can advocate as strongly as possible so long as we don't aggress, but nobody gets to aggress. That's our hard and fast rule number 1. And be a good human. Let's inspire people here to be a good human. That's the best we can do if we're going to get to peace. Anyways, my name is Mark Victor. I can always be reached through the Live and Let Live website, which is just liveandletlive.org. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for your attention.